On this week's 51%, we speak with Brady President Kris Brown about her work advocating for gun regulations in Washington and why it's difficult today.
Your zip code shouldn't determine whether you live or die by gun violence in this country, but right now it does.
We also learn about a ballot question in New York that, if approved, would amend the state constitution to include its own equal rights amendment. I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. I think it goes without saying that gun violence, particularly mass shootings, have shifted the way we operate as a society. Or I guess at least even just speaking for myself, it's changed the way that I think and operate in public settings, especially large crowds. Earlier this year, the U.S. Surgeon General declared gun violence a public health crisis. The CDC says more than 48,000 people died of gun-related injuries in 2022. And early in September, just a few weeks into the school year, a shooting at a high school in Winder, Georgia, left 4 people dead. And that's just one of the more than 400 mass shootings to occur so far this year, according to the nonprofit Gun Violence Archive. Brady, united against gun violence, has been pushing for gun regulations for 50 years, starting with the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, or Brady Bill, that established the country's federal background check system for gun sales in the early 1990s. Our guest today, Kris Brown, has been leading Brady as its president since 2017. Her day-to-day work involves lobbying lawmakers in Washington, D.C. and at the state level to expand the background check system, ban assault weapons, and enact so-called extreme risk laws for moving guns from people suffering with their mental health, among other issues. All of these proposals are touchy subjects in the U.S., where about a third of Americans say they own guns. A Pew Research poll this year found roughly 58% of Americans want to see stricter gun laws, but the issue is heavily divided along party lines, and the country is still split on whether it's more important to protect gun rights or pass gun regulations. I spoke with Brown about her work and what it's like today. Notably, our conversation was before the reported second assassination attempt against GOP presidential candidate and former President Donald Trump, but after the shooting in Georgia.
I go all across the country and talk to moms and dads in red states and blue states and cities and rural areas. And there's a lot more in common that parents and Americans have across this country than we don't have in common. And one of the issues that I repeatedly get asked is, what do I tell my kid when they're being told at school the solution to protect themselves if there is a shooter is run, hide, and fight? Because from kindergarten on up, that's what we're telling our children. I just had a conversation with the Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington, Virginia, who's a friend of mine who has a 13-year-old, and it really made me want to cry. She was crying. She's the head law enforcement officer for Arlington County, Virginia. And she was crying, relating to me that after the news of the shooting in Georgia came back, she said, "Mom, I don't feel like I can follow the guidance of run, hide, and fight. I'm just going to run. How do you feel about that?" And she said, "Yeah, you should just run, hun. You have to run." And her daughter said, "Because I feel like a lot of the shooters are students and they go through the lockdown drills too. They know where we're hiding." Just think about that. Her daughter is 13 years old. And then she added to that, which is just heartbreaking. And I felt better at my older school. She's switched schools because she's now in high school, because that school was next to woods and I knew exactly where I would hide. But there aren't any woods next to my school now. I find it more powerful and honestly helpful to relate these stories because they're the stories of everyday Americans struggling with trying to raise kids in an environment where gun violence is the #1 killer of our kids and where school shootings are far too common. And there are answers to it right before us. And I'm happy and thank you for asking me about some of those. But I first just want to pause at the human toll. 4 individuals who went to school in Georgia who did not come back, 2 educators, 2 students, and another community ripped apart by gun violence. And it just doesn't have to be this way. And then the whole aftermath of every student in school across this country literally scared. If that's not the kind of issue that I hear moms across the country saying, I want to solve this, that there really isn't another one. And that is what I hear all across the country. What can I do?
Well, we'll certainly get to that question in a second. But, first I wanted to talk a little bit about just how we got here. From your perspective, how did we get to this point where gun regulations are such a heated, debated issue? And, I hear from a lot of frustrated people that, these shootings keep happening and nothing changes.
Put simply, gun rights extremist groups, and I include the leadership of the National Rifle Association and the leadership of the Gun Owners of America, about 20 years ago, started providing more campaign contributions to certain politicians. And those politicians, in exchange for that money, agreed to look the other way. So the way we got here was a movement really catapulted by 2 individuals, Jim and Sarah Brady. Jim Brady was Ronald Reagan's press secretary. He was shot in the line of duty in the early 80s, just at the beginning of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And he was grievously injured. He and his wife, Sarah, became very frustrated as they looked into the facts and circumstances of his shooting and so many others, that while we had a federal law, the Gun Control Act, passed in 1968, that was supposed to ensure background checks were conducted before they were completed and denied to convicted felons, right, and others who we all agree shouldn't have guns, there was no mechanized system to ensure gun dealers could do that automatically. So it just wasn't happening. So they said, okay, let's make sure we get a law passed that makes it happen automatically. And they thought, that seems pretty straightforward. Let's see what we can do. The NRA fought them every step of the way. Let's just think about that for a second. They fought Jim and Sarah over 6 years and 7 votes about a system that stopped now 5 million sales of firearms to prohibited purchasers, to convicted felons, to convicted domestic abusers. And after Jim and Sarah beat them and passed the Brady Law in 1993, they turned around and got the assault weapons ban passed in 1994. Congress passed it. At the very last minute, a sunsetting provision was included, which means it lapsed in 2004. So we've been fighting ever since then for Congress to reinstate that ban, because just like in Georgia and too often in other mass shootings, an assault weapon is the weapon of choice. Where we've not been successful at the federal level, although I will say we just got a huge federal law passed 2 years ago, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Huge improvement there to our laws, and 16 Republicans voted yes. We've worked across the states to pass laws. But at this point in time, definitely we need more done, and we would want it done if we could at the federal level. So we have uniform rules across every single state, and not a situation where we have a Georgia with super weak laws, then a state like California with the strongest gun laws. Your zip code shouldn't determine whether you live or die by gun violence in this country, but right now it does.
So as far as Brady is concerned, what are you pushing for specifically in legislation to address gun violence? What's it going to take?
Well, let's see. How many days until November 5th? Because that's what it takes. We could solve this real fast, because up and down the ballot, we have a candidate in Kamala Harris and in Tim Walz who believe gun violence is a public health epidemic, who are embracing the solutions that Brady puts forward, and I'll talk about those in a second. And we have a candidate in Trump and J.D. Vance who call it fake news and just something we have to deal with in life. So in the ballot box, it's clear not only for president and vice president, but in the Senate, for every office where people are contesting and seeking that office, you have a gun violence prevention champion with very few exceptions. And you have someone who follows what J.D. Vance and Trump think, which is basically whatever the gun industry wants to sell more guns, that's what we'll do. Now, let's just imagine it's November 6th, and we have a gun violence prevention champion. And by the way, there are Republicans out there who are gun violence prevention champions. This is not solely a Democratic issue, but too often it is. But let's imagine November 6th, the election is done, and we have a gun violence prevention majority in the House of Representatives. We have a gun violence prevention majority in the Senate. That is possible, by the way. We've done the math. We've looked at the landscape. It is absolutely possible. And we have a gun violence prevention president and vice president, meaning Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. You know what would happen? We would get before the House and Senate a bill to expand Brady background checks in half of states, just like Georgia, who don't have them. We would get a mandate for states to pass extreme risk protection laws. Georgia didn't have that either. Imagine if Georgia had a law that says friends, neighbors, police could remove firearms from someone who has been deemed at risk, like 25 other states do, right? We could get an assault weapons ban through. We could remove PLACA. That's the immunity law Congress passed that seeks to limit the kinds of liability that the gun industry has for its products. No other industry has that. That's just the start. But those 4 bills, getting those through the House and Senate is totally dependent on having a gun violence prevention majority. And we, the people decide that on November 5th.
I guess what would you say to people? Because, I grew up in a region where most of what you just said would prompt the response, that's gun control, that's violating the Second Amendment, that's taking away our guns. So what would you say to that? Has Brady had to shift the way it approaches the conversation over the years here?
I would say one of the things that we say always is this is gun violence prevention. It's not gun control. Really, this is about a host of public health solutions that are proven effective all across the country that will save lives, right? When seatbelts were instituted because we had people dying of traffic fatalities and a national speed limit was instituted and bumper rails were put on the cars, we didn't say, gee, that's auto control. I object to that. We said, okay, what are reasonable safety measures that can save lives, that make sense? Let's put those in place. And you know what? They worked. Automobiles used to be the #1 killer of kids. They're not anymore. Guns are. And so the way we talk about this is rooted in understanding that guns have a rich history in this country. People in many parts of this country, including a huge percentage of Brady's staff, have guns. They go to shooting ranges. They enjoy skeet shooting. Some enjoy hunting. There's nothing foreign about that, and thinking that you also believe in reasonable gun safety measures. People are sometimes shocked to hear this, but these are the kinds of measures that were in place in the colonial era. Not exactly what I'm talking about today, because obviously society has changed, but we talk about the Wild West, for example. Let me just give one example of what I mean. In the Wild West, in frontier towns, there were laws in place well around when the Second Amendment existed, right? That said, if you're going to come into town and you have a firearm, you have to check your firearm at the town limit, because we are about protecting the safety of the public, and we don't believe that you should be openly carrying a firearm in our town. There were many laws like that. There were laws about how you should store your muskets. That's part of our heritage. There's nothing foreign about the idea that reasonable public safety measures go hand in hand with believing that the Second Amendment also protects gun ownership. The thinking differently is buying into a lie that the National Rifle Association began selling in about 1970. But before that, the organization believed in reasonable gun violence prevention measures, and they've been around since the late 1800s. So what I would just say is, we have a huge number of people, gun owners and non-gun owners, who are part of this movement because they understand, especially if you grew up with firearms, safety and learning safety a lot of times at your grandparents' knee. Look, I'm a Virginian. I have many friends who like skeet shooting and other things. They learned gun safety and safe storage of firearms from the moment that they were introduced to a firearm. That is 100% how it is. And that's what we're talking about here.
You know, the term responsible gun ownership, I think it's thrown around a lot in these conversations. And I guess I'm just wondering, how do you define responsible gun ownership? If you own guns and keep them at home, how are you supposed to store and treat them around other people to meet that definition? What does it look like?
Yes. Well, Brady started public messaging, just like Buckle Up, just like Designated Driver in 2018, to really describe to the public what that means. And I'd encourage all of your listeners to go to bradyunited.org and find out more about ending family fire, end family fire. It's very, very simple. 8 kids a day are killed or injured with a gun in their own home. 76% of school shooters, just like this shooter in Georgia, get their gun from a home where it is not safely stored. So what does safe storage look like? It means storing your gun unloaded, locked, ammo separate, locked, and not just the one gun that you have in the home and others in the garage, right? Some people have many guns. It means safely storing all of the firearms in your home. And my wish for our country, more than anything else that could happen, if every single American listening to this who has a gun in the home or knows they have a friend or neighbor who has a firearm in the home, let's normalize conversations about this. We don't have to vilify people who choose to have a firearm in the home. But if you have someone at heightened risk, you better be safely storing that firearm, irrespective of whether someone's at higher risk, actually. But sometimes in those cases, the best safe storage is remote storage. But if you choose to have a firearm in the home, then we need to ensure that everyone is safely storing that firearm. And if everyone in the US did that tomorrow, we would cut gun deaths in half. Why is that? Because about 60% of all gun deaths are suicide. A huge risk factor for suicide is the presence of a loaded and unsecured gun. Safe storage dramatically reduces suicide risk. It would end the 8 kids a day who are killed or injured with firearms in their own home. And the 76% of school shooters who go looking for a firearm in their home or a friend or aunt or uncle's home would not be able to access those firearms if they were safely stored. So that's something we can all do that can save a huge number of lives in this country.
Kris Brown is the president of Brady, United Against Gun Violence, which has been advocating for measures to address gun violence for 50 years. You can learn more about Brown's work at Brady's website, bradyunited.org. While the future of the Equal Rights Amendment for the U.S. Constitution is still up in the air, more than 100 years after it was drafted, New Yorkers will vote on whether to enact a state version this election day. New York's Equal Rights Amendment would prohibit discrimination on a person's ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and pregnancy outcomes. The legislation, which lawmakers passed earlier this year, has survived legal threats and court rulings throughout the summer. Recently, the Board of Elections released language on how the measure will appear on the ballot, which has concerned advocates and lawmakers. They argue voters will have a hard time understanding what the amendment will actually do, and have called on the Board of Elections to revise the language. To understand the impact of the measure and plans to educate voters ahead of Election Day, Chantel Destra of the New York Public News Network spoke with the lead sponsor of the legislation, Democratic New York State Senator Liz Krueger.
So this is a proposal that changes the New York State Constitution. Most of us don't walk around with a copy of the Constitution. We don't read it. It only really matters to us when there's some kind of lawsuit challenging that you've been discriminated against. And it even matters if you think you have a law protecting you, but then someone goes to court and says, well, that's not in the Constitution. So the law isn't really constitutional. So I really can discriminate against you. And that's wrong. So the last time this part of the Constitution was opened up for discussion or change was in the mid-1930s. That's almost 100 years ago. The world has changed. Who we are has changed. So right now, the Constitution only protects you from discrimination based on race, creed, and religion. But of course, there are many other reasons people get discriminated against, and we want to build into the Constitution that they can't discriminate against you based on ethnicity or national origin or age or disability or sex. And when you talk about sex, it includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and reproductive health rights, such as the right to carry a pregnancy or to end a pregnancy. And so that issue at this moment in history is particularly on most women's minds, if not everybody's minds, because what did we learn? We can't trust the Supreme Court. We're going to have to do it alone, folks, because the Supreme Court ruled against our reproductive health rights, even though no one believed that could ever be possible. And we're living in a country where 24 states have now basically moved towards complete banning of abortions and even birth control and even medical care for a miscarriage. So this country's getting a little crazy, and we have to strengthen our protections as much as we can in our Constitution, because we're a state, and I believe the vast majority of people don't want anyone discriminated against them or others, and we should make sure that that's clear in our Constitution.
And as we know, there have been some legal challenges to the amendment. Earlier this summer, a judge sided with Republican lawmakers to have the amendment thrown off the ballot, and then later the Court of Appeals restored the amendment to be back on the ballot. So what do you make of all the legal challenges on the amendment? Did anything surprise you?
No, we certainly expected this. And it was a Republican strategy to try to get this off the ballot because, shocking as it may be, the New York State Republican Party has fought abortion protections and rights and LGBT rights and other people's rights for as long as I've been in the Senate. And for the record, when they controlled the Senate from the late 30s through 2018, the vast majority of those years, they never entertained expanding or modernizing any of these rights in law. It was only on the second day of the Democratic control of the Senate in 2019 that we finally passed the Reproductive Health Act, establishing that the right to abortion was a health right within the health law. So I'm not surprised. And it was not an attempt that was going to be successful, and we knew that, but they tried. And now they are not saying they are working against the Equal Rights Amendment, but of course they are through sort of fake grassroots organizations that are funded by anti-choice funders and being operated through the Conservative Party with Republican Party blessings. So frankly, this has ended up being partisan, and it has ended up being sort of almost absurdly confusing because they don't want to come out and say, we're against abortion rights. But actually, that's what their effort is trying to do, stop abortion rights from moving forward in New York.
And what do you make of the perspective from critics who say that New York already has abortion access and reproductive rights, and the amendment is just too broad in its nature?
Okay, the amendment is not too broad in its nature. I just described to you who it's trying to protect. And don't we all think that people above a certain age should have equal rights? Don't we all think people with medical or physical or developmental disabilities should have equal rights? Don't we mostly think people should have equal rights if they're LGBT, if they have a different ethnicity than us? I mean, we sort of seem to establish that doing that for race and religion is not wrong. It's correct. It's been thus Constitution now for almost 100 years, and it's proved to be very important. So I don't know why people think we don't need this. And again, I'll go back to the Supreme Court reversing itself on Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. Other cases since then, states who at one time, very recently, supported abortion rights, reversing themselves. You know, you only need one change in a governor's office to blow this whole thing up. And frankly, we almost got an anti-choice Republican last governor's election. It was just a 3% difference. So when people say it doesn't matter here, I'm like, you're not really paying attention. Yes, it does matter. It matters for everyone.
And when the Board of Elections posted language on the measure earlier this summer, there was a lot of concern because the measure, as it appears on the ballot, will not include the words abortion or LGBTQ+, and supporters seem to be worried that the impact of the measure may not be clear to voters at this juncture. So I'm curious, what will be the strategy from Democrats to improve awareness of the ballot measure heading into November?
Great question. So yes, we're very disappointed that the Board of Election, which is made up of 2 Republican commissioners and 2 Democratic commissioners, did not do what the law said they were supposed to do, which was to turn all ballot questions into simple English at no more than an 8th grade reading level. We passed a separate law saying that, but they ignored it, and somehow the courts let them get away with it. So instead we get a 15th grade reading level and a very complex set of language. And it's true, constitutional language is complex with intention, which is why we wanted the simpler English for the ballot. We didn't get that. So now our job is to make sure everybody understands exactly what this ballot amendment would do. And we are confident when they understand that, they will vast majority vote for it. But we are very disturbed that there are various groups spreading completely untrue storylines about this, that somehow if you vote yes on this ballot proposal, people are going to come and take your children and force them to have gender changing surgery. No, nothing to do with this amendment, not true. That you're going to be forced to have no girls' sports teams in schools. No, not true. Nothing to do with this amendment. So they keep spreading some pretty ridiculous statements because they know they just can't come out and say, hey, we don't think there should be abortion rights in New York State. We don't think there should be LGBT rights in New York State. So we're going to panic you all with false information and get you to not vote yes. So our job is to make it clear to people exactly what this amendment will do, because truthfully, up until now, when you say to people, please vote yes for the ERA proposal 1, they go, what the hell are we talking about? And that's the problem. So we need to get the word out. We need to invest in making sure we're letting voters know they need to turn over the ballot.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Senator.
Thank you very much.
That was New York State Senator Liz Krueger speaking with Chantel Destra of the New York Public News Network. Election Day is November 5th. Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio based in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Madeleine Reynolds, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at our website, WAMCpodcast.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else. I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half. He was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night and down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool